Good morning, and thank you all for joining us for today's book talk. I'm Dave Shullman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's session, which we are co-hosting with the Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. We're here today to discuss a new book by DFR Lab visiting fellow Isaac Stone-Fish, America Second: How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger. Isaac's book traces the evolution of the Chinese Communist Party's influence in America. He argues that many in the United States initially welcomed China's entry into the US economy, believing that trade and engagement would lead to a more democratic China, but that our resulting dependence on China, particularly the dependence of our elites, has damaged the United States' ability to challenge China, and that we need to figure out how to push back on the party's influence without exacerbating the plague of anti-Asian racism that's currently a problem in our country, or ushering in a new McCarthyism. It's a truly entertaining book, it's a controversial book, and it's an important book, and I'm very happy that Isaac is here to discuss it with us today. In addition to his fellowship with DFR Lab, Isaac is also the CEO and founder of the research firm Strategy Risks, which quantifies corporate exposure to China. He is a contributing columnist at the Washington Post, a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund, an on-air contributor to CBSN, and the author of a monthly column on China risk for Barron's. Isaac, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
We'll be kicking off today's event with a one-on-one discussion between Isaac and myself, followed by a moderated group discussion with a distinguished panel of experts. So before I turn to Isaac, I'd like to introduce our other panelists. First up, we have Dr. Jacqueline Deal. Dr. Deal is the president and CEO of the Long-Term Strategy Group, a Washington, D.C. based defense firm that conducts research and analysis on trends shaping the emerging security environment. Her work is focused on the military modernization of the People's Republic of China, alternative PRC futures, and U.S. strategy. She has briefed senior officials across the last 3 administrations and testified before the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission several times. Thank you, Jackie, for joining us this morning. Also joining us virtually is Jennifer Hong. Ms. Hong is a senior director at the Project 2049 Institute. She joined Project 2049 after over 10 years of federal government experience. She worked at the U.S. Department of State and National Science Foundation in various capacities, working on human rights and anti-trafficking issues across Asia and the Pacific Islands, and leading strategic communications in the fields of foreign policy, law enforcement, and science and engineering. Thank you for joining us as well, Jennifer. So we look forward to learning from our panelists in just a bit. But before we get started, I'd like to remind our audience members joining via Zoom to submit your questions during today's event using Zoom's Q&A function. And we will aim to get to as many of your questions as possible at the end of the event. So with that, I'd like to turn to Isaac for some opening thoughts about his book and why he wrote it. Isaac, over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you for those in the audience and for the Atlantic Council for hosting me for this. So the book came out of a frustration that I had when I returned from Beijing, where I'd been living for most of my 20s, 2006 to 2011. And I started to hear Americans speak about China in the same way that the party wanted them to speak about China. And I just thought it was very strange to have that language repeated. So party phrases like, China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, China has 5,000 years of history, China just seeks peace. And the issue with some of these phrases are less their veracity and more that they're party slogans. And yes, the party has helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but it also helped keep hundreds of millions of people in poverty for quite some time. And later on, I draw the comparison between that and the phrase "all lives matter." So 15 years ago, if you said "all lives matter," it wouldn't be controversial at all. Now, if you say it, you're repeating a right-wing slogan and showing support for a movement that's against Black Lives Matter. And so it's not, do all lives matter or not? It's, oh, you're repeating a controversial slogan. And I think people didn't realize that when they would say, oh, China has 5,000 years of history. China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And so there was all these little traces. And as I grew up into the field and into the career, I would notice all of this care, this excessive care, this self-censorship around sensitive issues in China. And I was used to it because when I was in China, I would often speak that way as well. I would often self-censor. But being back in the United States, it didn't feel like we needed to be restricted in this way. And then I realized the powerful combination of business ties and policy ties among many of the retired senior elite who dealt with China. So most of my book, a lot of my book rather, focuses on our great friend Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. I talk about Madeleine Albright, I talk about the Bush family, Scowcroft a little bit as well. And all of these people had been doing a lot of business with US companies trying to enter and flourish in the China market, at the same time being very representative and very influential on think tanks, including this one, across DC. And the issue is not, well, these folks shouldn't go into business. You could make that point, but the issue is that they would be both policy advisors and business people and not transparent about their disclosures, not transparent about why they were doing what they were doing. And so I think we've all misunderstood Kissinger in the China field for so long, because we've all given him way too much credit as a brilliant strategic thinker, which he very much is, but really what we should be seeing him as is a business person. And it's fine. I think I'm mostly a business person now. It's a completely legitimate thing to do, but we have to be careful about pretending that he is this great independent thinker and understanding that since 1982, when he founded Kissinger Associates, really what he is a businessman. And I think as I went through this book, which looks at the DC business nexus, which looks at the influence of the Chinese Communist Party in Hollywood, which looks at self-censorship in universities, and looks at how do we do this while defending the rights of Chinese and Chinese Americans, I realized a lot of the issues is around transparency. How do we have these conversations? How do we talk about this? Also, how do we democratize the China field? Really, for so long, Beijing has excelled at finding almost exclusively old white men to be the ones who are the China whisperers, to be the ones who are the bridges, and to really try to keep the China field out of Congress, out of the American people, and just have it be Kissinger, Bush, Scowcroft, folks like that, Al Haig in the 80s, as the ones who, quote unquote, understand China and allow them to be the vectors, to be the bridges. But I think that's a disservice to our democracy. It's a disservice to the way in which US policy should be made. And I hope that this book can spark a conversation, can allow a lot of people who have varying interests to be a lot more involved in the China space and in what's a very, very important national conversation.
That's great. Yeah, I know you've done a lot of work on kind of trying to bolster that democratization of the China field. I think that's fantastic. So my first question comes back to what you just kind of dove into a little bit, which is not surprisingly the most controversial aspect of the book for many people, which is your strong critique of Henry Kissinger and some other very prominent leaders who dedicated their government career, at least, to bolstering U.S. leadership and interests around the world. So I guess my question would be, do you view these individuals as intentionally looking to undermine U.S. interest at China's behest? And if not, how do you, and you talked a little bit about this already, but how do you contextualize their actions, particularly given the fact, as you write, up until fairly recently, there was an assumption that to intertwine the U.S. and Chinese economies more deeply was of benefit not just to China, but to the United States and China relationship, to peace and stability, in addition to benefiting people personally.
It's so difficult to ascribe motive and to get inside people's heads. None of these people wanted to talk to me for the book, and so I have quotes from the representatives, but not from them. I think one thing that has been lost about Kissinger's reputation is and this is a direct quote from someone who worked for him, just his need to deceive. So there was I remember reading the obituary of a Kissinger aide who the New York Times called Kissinger's Kissinger. And Helmut Sonnenfeld, I think his name was. And he said that some men lie because it's in their interest, and Kissinger lies because it's in his nature. Bush Sr., when he was president, and meeting with Gorbachev, I think it was, said that, told Gorbachev, I know you had met, this is a paraphrase, I know you'd met recently with Kissinger, but I'm not going to really take much into what he says because, of course, after all, it's Kissinger. And so we've lost that sense of Kissinger, and as his time in government and his time as a more public figure has receded, we just see him as this sage, and we don't remember this part of his reputation. And Kissinger excels at manipulating those in the media, those around him, to create this cone of silence around what he's done. And in some ways, he's very controversial for what he did with Vietnam and in Cambodia. And I don't mean to discredit that. I mean, I think those are very important stories, but it's all of what has happened since then has really been lost from the public view. And I think it's really important to have these conversations, have these debates. I think in terms of motives for the other people, I think so there's no perfection in this. We are all compromised in some way. We are all influenced. There's no objectivity here. The former American Express chairman, who is a Kissinger client, said, show me a situation with no conflicts of interest, and I'll show you a situation where there's a level of mediocrity where nothing ever gets done. I think that's important. I mean, Mao Zedong, his phrase on it, his very peasant phrase on it is, clear water has no fish. We're all in this. None of us are pure. And I think it's important to understand, while we're doing this, so I have a lot of interests on my own about who I criticize, who I don't. I am not impartial. I'm very imperfect on these things. And I think that's an important piece of the debate, to understand that people are bringing a lot of baggage, both from their backgrounds, but also from the business that they do or the network that they're in DC.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting part of your book, actually, that you go into your own conflicts of interest to make the point that everyone has them. I don't know if there's anything else you want to kind of say about that piece.
I think when I was a journalist, there was this idea that you need to be impartial, but there was also, you'd have sources, and the sources would tell you things, and you wouldn't want to burn your sources because they were giving you valuable information, but sometimes you would also cover those sources. And how do you then write about that person in that particular way? And I think people who are very effective communicators with the media understand that sometimes they can pressure editors, they can pressure journalists, and they can make them more or less likely to be critical of them. I think with the business that I do now, I'm basically a consultant, and we work with a handful of large companies and some smaller companies, and then it's how do you talk about that publicly? You don't disclose your company names. Often there's pretty serious NDAs that you sign for that. And you also, you don't want to displease them because, they're paying you. And so it's understanding, okay, well, he's not coming at this from some lofty individual independent perspective, but he is enmeshed as well. Yeah. And so I think it's important to, try to be forthright about those things.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that nobody's entirely clean. It's a fairly gray world. Yeah. And I think it's one where there's a lot of balance that has to be involved, and that's one other question I wanted to ask, which kind of gets back to what we were discussing earlier about the critique of prominent individuals, but also not just kind of former leaders of the U.S. national security system, but also people who are in academia or journalists or people, and you talk a lot about self-censorship, right? And this sense that people have been kind of holding back in order to ensure they have access to China. They won't criticize China on some of these more sensitive subjects. And you're fairly specific about some of those situations and those examples. That's a big part of the book. And then another big part of the book is, of course, talking about how to not go toward a McCarthyist type of new dynamic in our country, where people are criticizing each other for being insufficiently defending of the United States interests, or too close to China, not tough enough on China. So I'm curious, how do you think that balance works out? How do you think your book fits into striking that proper balance as we, deal with this situation, not just now, but for the decades ahead?
I think Americans should be allowed to support those who want to be communist, those who want to be socialist, those who want a closer relationship with China, those who feel like the United States should recede from the global stage. I think there's a multiplicity of viewpoints is so incredibly important. And what I have a lot of problem with is those who do it, is the corruption aspect of it. Those who do it because they're paid for it. And I think there's plenty of people in the DC world who just strongly believe in a stronger relationship with China. And I don't agree with them, but I think it's fantastic that they believe that way. And I think having conversations with them, learning, modifying our viewpoints as we gather more information is very important. So I think it's not, we must purge the influence of the Communist Party from the United States, but we must have stricter laws, stricter regulations, and more transparency around the consulting and the lobbying that so many former leaders do. That's the one that I have the real problem with, is people who go into the government, leave the government, make money that encourages them to speak a certain way about certain issues, and making people think, oh, this is just what they believe. And for so long, the business community has been dominated by men like Kissinger in the China space. Oh, this is the way we must talk about China. This is the way we must do things. And he was so astoundingly influential. I have a real problem with that. And I think the focus on Americans like Kissinger is also in some ways a macrocosm of focusing on Charles Lieber, in the Harvard chemistry professor who's arrested for not disclosing his China ties. I think focusing on the culpability and complicity of white male Americans is one way that we don't have the debate too much around Chinese Americans, spying, espionage, issues that are much, much trickier for us to deal with as a country. And I think it's very important, both for ethical and strategic reasons, that the debate doesn't become about that. We have an awful history and present of racism, and need to be having this conversation in a way that's cognizant and respectful of that.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, and the Lieber case, of course, in itself has some controversy around it. So maybe we'll come back to that topic in a second. At this point, I'd like to bring in our two distinguished panelists to hear their analysis of Isaac's book and discuss their research on how today's discussion fits into the broader trends of U.S.-China relations and that they are tracking. So first, Dr. Deal, I'm going to kind of turn to you and see if you have any thoughts you want to share just as an initial offering.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's an honor to speak at the Atlantic Council. You do great work through the Global China Hub and the DFR Lab. It's also great to be here with old friends and new friends. We'll come back to that word, friends. I guess I come at this from the standpoint of doing research on the Chinese Communist Party and its history and strategy. And so I think it would be helpful to kind of take the conversation in the direction of, what does the CCP get out of this? And why is it so important to them to cultivate influential, important Americans? If you go back through the history of our interactions with the Chinese Communist Party, one thing that's striking, and it's well documented in Isaac's book, is the degree to which, from the beginning, the people who were kind of our guides, who were interpreting China for us, for the Chinese Communist Party, the people who were interviewing Mao and hanging out in Yan'an and telling us about this new revolutionary party, they were themselves enamored of the CCP. They were communists in some cases, sympathizers in others. And so right from the start, our kind of aperture or our access has been not objective, but rather kind of shaded or biased in the direction of sympathy. And the word that is often used by the CCP to talk about foreigners who serve some useful function is friends or old friends of the CCP. I think Americans hear the word friend and they think friend, as we understand that term, but as Isaac documents in the book, from the CCP's point of view, friend more often than not, unfortunately, means pawn, stooge, instrument, useful idiot, fellow traveler, something more akin to one of those. Why is this important for what the CCP wants to get done today? Arguably, even more important for the Chinese Communist Party in its thinking about its strategy for handling the United States and navigating the PRC's rise. Even more important than the kind of military balance, the traditional defense competition, is the kind of economic or techno-economic, economic and technological competition. And the role of Friends of China in keeping people in Washington, D.C. or in the halls of power in the United States from properly identifying the character of the competition is very important to the CCP strategy. It keeps us from recognizing that we're not just dealing with another trade partner in China. We're dealing with a geopolitical rival, an ideological rival. If we see the US-PRC relationship that way, and we don't see it as just another kind of international commercial relationship, then of course we begin to think much harder about flows of technology, flows of intellectual property, flows of capital. And this, I think, is what the CCP would like to stop. So already, I think the United States and people in Washington, D.C., unfortunately for the CCP, fortunately for us, have woken up. But it's kind of been a remarkable run for the CCP to get to this point where in the year 2022, some people, still contest whether they're an ideological rival, a geopolitical rival. Some people would still argue that it's important for us to kind of treat them as just another trade partner. I think those voices are kind of being outnumbered at this point, but I think it's a testament to the strategy that they've employed of cultivating these friends that it's gotten to this point, or that they've gotten so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. That's really helpful, and I think a lot to dig into in our upcoming discussion. But first, let me turn to Ms. Hong for her opening thoughts. Jennifer, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for the Atlanta Council for having me here today. Also, the Digital DFR Lab for having me here today as well. Isaac, it's nice to meet you. I bought your book, and I think I read it within the 24-hour period, couldn't put it down. So it's an honor to be here on this panel with you. I just thought that you did a good layout of the transgression of the 7 different administrations in big and small ways that were varying in degree of just how they became beholden to the Chinese Communist Party. And that as I was reading, I just felt sad and angering emotions as I was thinking about today's industries, just entertainment, academics, that we became so reliant on that 1.4 billion people market, both in the United States and in China. And I'm not agreeing with that, but I understand, because I think, it's easier always to judge in hindsight why those decisions were made. But I know that there are business leaders that are thinking about this right now as they want to be less complicit in the CCP propaganda, the atrocities, right? So they're trying to wean off of China. They're thinking of alternative options. And I really hope that your book will help them spark their thoughts into how they can do that, follow these businesses as their lead. And then, as universities are thinking about, their desire to promote the study of Chinese language and its, rich culture and history, but then being faced with the need of money, right? And that's how they're beholden to China. And so, hopefully, once again, this book will help them think about what is a partnership that's less skewed, that's based more on fair and transparency. That would be helpful for both the university and the students that they're serving. I love the way you ended the book with, really delineating what it means to talk about, when we talk about China, that we're talking about Chinese people, and when we're talking about CCP, we really need to delineate that messaging. And I think that's so important, that we disentangle ourselves from the possibility of being, racist, right? Individually and collectively. And so that sparked me into thinking about what are the ways in which, individually, like us, collectively in the sectors that we belong, what can we do? And I have 2 thoughts before pass it over to the panel. I was just thinking about, what can we do? And one was, how do we recognize and empower the agency of the Chinese people, right? So CCP censors us because it can. I mean, not necessarily because it needs to, but it can. And it takes on this patronizing role over its people, right? So it expresses grief, anger, sadness whenever there is some small, perceived offense against the 3 T's that you talked about in your book. And we look down upon these patronizing stance, right? We look at them and we say, oh, that just goes against what we believe as, freedom-loving Americans. But I think we're, in essence, maybe doing the same thing when we are self-censoring and we are quickly responding, right? So we're complicit in telling the Chinese people that we also know what is good and not good for them. So look, you use the MBA example, the American education, the Hollywood movies, right? These are soft power things that the Chinese people are, I wouldn't say there's a demand for it, because that implies open market, right? So this is something that they are now kind of expecting it, right? That when they go to the movie theater, there is some Hollywood movies, that when they turn on their TV, there is some NBA games to be played, and that when they get to a certain age, that they could go to an American universities. Now, if next time there is a perceived transgression, and instead of quickly apologizing for it, right, we pause. And so CCP will take away that arm, right, as a punishment to us. They'll take that away, but then pausing and feeling that pain of absence with the Chinese people. Instead of quickly, coming in and saving and fixing the issue, it's like, no, let's pause and let's experience that loss together. And then I would love to see how people of China responds to that. Now, that may take months and years, and I'm not even talking about the economic benefit here. I'm just talking purely in a psychological kind of a sense. What if we gave the Chinese people an opportunity to respond, right? That was one thing that I was thinking about. And then the second thing is, how do we capitalize on the industries that have not yet or not as infiltrated? You mentioned the TV industry, right? Although my colleagues and I were all the other day talking about Space Force season 2 is wrought with lots of Chinese placements, product placements, but music industry, right? You juxtapose the music industry with the movie industry, with the Tibetan movement. So there are definitely these industries that we can tap into, right? I think that the time is now for us to really actively identify these industries and see how we can use that as a medium to portray the more accurate and realistic picture of China under the CCP leadership. I think that's really important for us because I think you said this in the book, CCP doesn't want to weaken or push out these companies, right? In a way, they just want them because they can continue to exercise this discourse power over these companies. And I think that we need to be active in identifying these industries and try to work with them. So I turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. That was great. And you dug into so many different topics that I want to cover here in our discussion, whether it's influence in Hollywood or the influence kind of on college campuses, in addition to, of course, the influence in our broader economy. But before we dig into those specifics, I kind of want to ask more of a macro question, which is, for the whole panel, how do China's influence efforts and our efforts to counter them factor into this broader, deepening strategic rivalry that we find ourselves in between the United States and China? And I've kind of opened that up to whoever wants to take it first. But I think kind of laying that groundwork is helpful for people, especially who say, well, why does all this really matter?
I think it's helpful to distinguish what Beijing does, the types of influence operations that they do that are unique to China and other Leninist countries, and the broader ones that they do. And I think the ones that we should be much more worried about are the ones that play with United Front ideas. The United Front is a Chinese ministry that seeks to strengthen China's friends and weaken its enemies. And I think figuring out, being able to trace, so every sister city relationship with China and the United States goes through the United Front. Or to understand, when certain influential Americans go to China, the United Front is the one that okays their visas or is in the meetings as part of the process. And I think with the, my accusation of Kissinger as an agent of Chinese influence, I think understanding what the United Front ideas, what Beijing wants out of those things is helpful as we try to understand the debate. And it's also helpful because certain people can, like I said before, and I think it's very important to emphasize, can independently come to these conclusions, can independently say, yes, I do believe it's very important for us to have a far closer relationship with China, and to not castigate those who are coming to these views in ways that are far less from Beijing's espionage, Beijing's influence operations.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Anyone else, Jennifer or Jackie?
Another way of thinking about it, a complementary way, is why does the CCP leap to not only, as Jennifer said, accuse us of hurting the feelings of 1.3 or 1.4 billion Chinese people a lot, but why does it also frequently accuse us of trying to kind of westernize and divide China or implant the virus of democracy or peacefully evolve it? One explanation is that's what they believe, or that's the story that they tell about how the USSR collapsed or how we successfully won the Cold War. Mm-hmm. Another explanation is it's their kind of way of thinking about international competition, period writ large, and it's also a way that they're thinking about trying to prevail over us. And so when Isaac talks about the United Front, it's important for us to recognize their theory of victory, as it were, involves magnifying or growing the number of people who are supportive of China in the United States, China as the CCP regime, PRC, and reducing or discrediting the people who are, if you will, hawks or opposed and worried about the PRC. So it's a very kind of insidious or infiltration-heavy strategy, and the United Front is an organization with many tentacles. It's a great bureaucracy. It has, obviously, the 2049 Institute has done a wonderful study of the military apparatus connections to the United Front, but there's also civilian, foreign ministry, industry tentacles, and it's an intelligence collecting organization as well. And many people think, certainly Xi Jinping thinks, we're in a kind of informatized or intelligence-sized world and competition these days. And so the country with access to the most data, the country that can turn data into a means of production and use it to grow its economy will prevail. And China, through the United Front, has many kind of tentacles into our data here. And so I think understanding this theory of victory or strategy from the PRC can help us be more mindful of what we need to protect here at home, what we need to think about accessing in the PRC if we want to win in 21st century geopolitical competition. So it's very helpful.
Yeah. Jennifer, anything to add?
No, nothing more to add.
I think that's a great kind of help of laying the groundwork of what we're talking about here. And so now we'll come back to this question of Hollywood, because I think it's really fascinating and important. And as has been discussed, the book addresses Hollywood's willingness to spread China's propaganda, or at the very least, reluctance to put out content that is critical of things of China or of things that the CCP doesn't want to have talked about. Why do you think, for any of you, why do you think this happens? Why do we not have more outrage about it, right, from our society or from our favorite celebrities? And why ultimately does it really matter? I mean, some people would say, well, it's just Hollywood, right? It's just the kind of movies that we choose to go to the theater or not these days to watch. How does that really affect this broader question of U.S.-China competition?
I think part of it is our inability to understand one type of racism. So I'm Jewish. I'll talk about it from a Jewish perspective. So there's anti-Semitism and there's philo-Semitism. There's, something negative about Jews, or, oh gosh, I got to make sure I have a Jewish lawyer, or I got to make sure I have a Jewish accountant. They're so much better. And I think we have a sophisticated enough understanding of that, whereas if every movie in Hollywood portrayed Jews in a positive light, there'd be a huge outcry. Mm-hmm. It would be so absurd, it's so cartoonish. But because of a host of complicated factors, the fact that every Chinese in an American movie is portrayed positively, we somehow see that as something that's friendly as opposed to a crude racist portrayal. It's very, very silly. And I remember 2017 going to a movie theater in Chongqing and seeing Wolf Warrior 2, this incredibly jingoistic Chinese Rambo. And in the beginning of the movie, the hero fights against rapacious Chinese real estate developers. And I thought, oh, Chinese bad guys. Right. Some Chinese people in films in China are bad guys, but not in the United States. And it was just so striking to me to watch this very sanctioned, very propagandistic Chinese movie and have it have a far more critical portrayal of Chinese people than any major studio film that's come out in Hollywood in roughly 10 years.
I hope you're advising your clients in New York that the real estate bubble was really going to crack or to be burst, because that was an early warning, an early indicator.
Any other thoughts?
I would like to add. Yeah, I would like to add. I just don't know how many people know about the influence and that's why Isaac's book is going to be so helpful, right? That people are going to read this book and see the infiltration that has happened. Until I read the book, I don't know if I could clearly articulate the amount of infiltrations. Yes, you know about the Transformers. Yes, you know about certain things, but as a collective whole, I don't think that people know that. And so that's probably another reason why people aren't thinking about that much influence in ways that we're talking about it here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, I want to raise one of the audience questions that's come in just because it's highly relevant to this area, which is, how can Washington act on Chinese influence in Hollywood without violating freedom of speech? What can Washington, is there any role for the US government in dealing with this particular problem?
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think, so other countries fund their film industries, and the United States hasn't really. I think, there's a possibility for more, and it's also when you start having government funding, then the government wants certain things in certain films. But I think, the way I see it actually is facilitating a landscape for, and this is a bit of an odd comparison, but in some ways for more of films like The Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson film, which was so odious to so many people in Hollywood, but so popular outside of Hollywood, and to understand that films with a realistic portrayal of China, not a demeaning portrayal, but a realistic portrayal of China, can have quite a large audience. I think the push for transparency too. I think there's some regulations favor the larger companies because they can build really large compliance departments to deal with it, but some also very much favor the consumers. And I think the issue with Hollywood films is less that the particular studio itself is taking money from a Chinese investor, and more that other arms of the studio want to push for censorship so that they don't have issues. I think Disney is probably the best example. It's the largest. It has huge businesses in China. Disney Shanghai at least was, and probably still is, 55% owned by firms owned by the Shanghai government. And so understanding that that's the reason, as opposed to, this particular movie playing in China or not. So requiring more transparency about these influences could be something that the government can do.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? I want to broaden that out a little bit to talk about the role that any of you see for the US government in responding to the Chinese government's successful efforts, not just with Hollywood, but also to get the US private sector, whether it's the NBA, as we've already discussed, or major corporations, to self-censor or otherwise accommodate the interests of the Chinese Communist Party.
I can take a stab at that. I mean, what we're seeing now is American companies, major corporations kind of in the crosshairs of complying with US law and doing what they need to do as American companies, and complying with these new regulations that are coming down from the CCP regime that are, increasingly onerous and increasingly, frankly, kind of inconsistent in spirit, if not letter, with their obligations to the United States with regard to the way that they're going to treat data, the way that they may have to give it up, the way that they may have to delegate authority. I was recently shown a consultancy report that was being circulated among overseas firms with a Chinese presence, and it said, obviously, in recent times, there have been major changes. There's this idea of common prosperity and dual circulation. These are now themes of Xi's governance, and we're all dealing with the pandemic, but we want to kind of emphasize there's still a huge amount of opportunity for foreign companies in the PRC. What you have to know, though, is the following. The new conditions require that you give your Chinese office heads much more authority. You delegate more. Obviously, you're not going to be able to visit them as much because of COVID-0, and you're already experiencing that. So you need to delegate more authority. You also need to invest more capital, because common prosperity requires a lot of investment for social good in China. So you need to give authority, you need to give capital, and you need to give your Chinese office heads or your PRC office heads a greater role in the corporate governance, the central corporate governance of the company overseas. So if you just do those three things, then things will go well for you in the PRC. And so I talked to some American firms that were kind of on the receiving end of this study. And I said, how does this read to you? And they said, it kind of reads like a hostage note. And we feel like we've already done a lot for for China, frankly. We've transferred a lot of intellectual property. We've trained a lot of people. We've produced very high quality goods. We think we've already given a lot, and then to be on the receiving end of these kind of demands for authority, money, insight and access and influence to the company's broader governance, maybe that's a kind of bridge too far. Maybe that is the straw that's breaking the camel's back for a lot of these firms. So I think this is a very interesting moment when the head of Intel had to apologize recently. You all saw for complying with the We Are Forced Labor Prevention Act in the PRC at the same moment that practically that he's standing with our president and being touted for spending $20 billion, was it, in Ohio for committing to build those fabs. That's a funny position for any kind of U.S. corporation to be in, and I don't envy those leaders, but they're navigating it.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that, which is, question of, with growing tension in the U.S.-China relationship, the Chinese government now openly lobbying the U.S. business community to push back on proposed legislation designed to make the U.S. more competitive with China. As you just kind of laid out, Jackie, how, is it going to become much more difficult for U.S. businesses in the future to navigate this problem and to kind of navigate being in the middle and short of full disengagement from China? What would you advise business leaders to do? You did touch on a fair amount of that, but I'm curious if any other thoughts on what businesses ought to do in this moment, because it's a very tricky position to be in.
Both Beijing and Washington want U.S. businesses to choose sides, and it's increasingly difficult to follow both regulatory regimes. So there's an anti-foreign sanctions law now in China, which says if you advocate for sanctions, you could be in violation of PRC law. So let's say you're a big U.S. bank and you're debating whether or not to work with ICBC or Bank of China, and you want to say, okay, who's more likely to be sanctioned? Commissioning that research could violate the anti-foreign sanctions law because you could be saying, well, one of these should be sanctioned. Yeah. But you also need that information because you don't want to work with a bank that will be sanctioned. And so what we advise companies to do is further hive off these sensitive operations from China. There's a lot with Xinjiang that needs to be done, and it needs to be done outside of China. And I think what a lot of companies don't realize is talking about these things in China, asking about Xinjiang, about forced labor, is quite unethical for your Chinese partners, for your Chinese suppliers, and for your foreigners working in China. And so you need to be doing these things outside. I think companies should also realize that plenty of people inside the DoD believe we are already fighting some sort of war with China. I think the conversation about, is this a Cold War or not, is pretty misplaced. I think the conversation should be, what is the likely sparks for hot war? And then what should we do about that? And I think businesses need to have a plan where if China invades Taiwan, or when perhaps China invades Taiwan and the US decides to fight to stop it, what are they going to do? Because it's sad to say, but I do feel like if/when we were at a war with China, if it's a large war, which is very possible, the Americans in China are going to be seen as enemy combatants, and businesses need to have a strategy for that.
Yeah, and adding to that business, what the U.S. government can do for the business, I think it'd be really helpful if the U.S. government could articulate what is our end state in our relationship with China. I think we need to figure that out because I think it's rather confusing for many people. When are we working towards coexistence? Are we looking to? You had a Cold War example, right? Are we breaking up, or are we mellowing out? The Soviet Union. Are we cooperating? I just don't think that we say we are in a strategic competition. Yes, that's a state of where we are, and then we've heard tools like decoupling, strategic coupling, decoupling, strategic coupling. And then made in USA. Right? There's a lot of different tools that people throw out there, but I don't think that we have a very clear, articulated understanding that we could then tell our business leaders, allies, academic institutions, and individuals to kind of get in line. And so I think the US government, needs to better articulate the end goal.
I think that's an excellent point. And it's something that I struggle with a lot, what the end goal should be. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what it should be.
What it should be. Oh, that I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be just working at a think tank if that were my role and decision to be able to decide. I don't know. And I'm not saying I have an answer to that because I don't. I really don't know in just the way we are where we should be. I don't have an answer for that.
One preliminary thought. I think our former Deputy National Security Advisor, Matt Pottinger, has suggested that we don't have to put forward kind of concrete goals for the CCP or the PRC. Our goal should be a little bit more humble. It can be for ourselves. And right now, I think the priority should be on protecting ourselves, protecting our interests from this kind of united front-centric, aggressive strategy from the CCP to kind of weaken us from within. We have to do the things that are necessary to do to kind of make sure that we're not vulnerable to that kind of approach. Unfortunately, from the CCP's point of view, because we've been relatively open for so long, it will seem like a big change, or it has seemed like a big change, that we're shifting to more of a robust defensive posture. But really, that's, the steps that we're taking are not about any kind of ambition for the PRC. They're an ambition to do what the US government's job is, which is to protect our own interests.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think linking back to this notion of having a sense of our end state, but then also really having a sense of what we internally want to do to better protect ourselves and to kind of prepare ourselves for what we expect to be a long-term, lasting strategic competition and rivalry with China. And that brings me to my next question, which is, we kind of touched a little bit about this already, but the Justice Department is set to announce changes to the China Initiative, which has been accused of stoking anti-Asian racism and suspicion, including on college campuses. So my question would be, to come back to this issue of what's happening at universities, what would an effective university response to Chinese government influence efforts look like? And how can universities and other institutions publicly identify and punish individuals who are legitimately, truly engaged in illegal influence activities without creating a new Red Scare or inflaming racism or creating the situation where all students of Chinese ethnic descent are somehow become suspect on a campus?
Much better job of due diligence before partnerships and before hiring. It's far less controversial to not let someone be a visiting fellow because they're a PLA colonel than to accuse someone of being a PLA colonel after they've been there and to not be able to prove it, or frankly to be wrong about it. And I think the other piece is that universities need to listen to students who want more transparency about endowments. And there's some big pushes in Georgetown and Catholic University and GW to say, well, you've been great about not building coal plants. Why are you helping support concentration camps in Xinjiang? And I think doing that and recognizing the other side of it is very valuable. I think also, and the pandemic has done so much more to close off China from the world than anything that the US has done in a very sad way. But I think understanding, trying to foster debate, and some of it sounds hokey and old-fashioned, but debate among Chinese students, because there's such a wide multiplicity of views among Chinese students who are here. And they're the ones who are the most vulnerable in here. I think so much in these kind of conversations, they get cast as the aggressors, when really, in most cases, they are much more likely to be victims. And so how do you do that? How are you safe with them? I think there's been some good innovations, I think at Princeton, about, hey, here, you don't have to use your name. Here's how we can talk about these things. Here's how we have really good data security for it, because we don't want Chinese students to come here to tweet something about Xi Jinping and then be arrested when they go back. And on the one hand, it's not the United States' fault. That's the problem of the Communist Party. On the other hand, we don't want to be facilitating that. We want to find a way that people can have open debates, with our rules, but also not endanger them when they go back. And it's a very, very difficult thing to do, but I think it's a very, very important thing.
Yeah, I think all good points. And I'm glad you mentioned some of the initiatives that are being undertaken by, I think it's the Athena Institute and others, to push for divestment from Xinjiang at Georgetown, my alma mater, and other schools. So it's good to see that. Any other thoughts on this topic?
One thing that maybe I'll add is, opportunities, and you talked about hokey ideas, but looking for opportunities where we can really counter, the messaging by the Chinese government, the CCP party, for identifying common successes, common aim of innovation, common goals of upholding truth and transparency. Every time we can counter that message through a campaign that's university-wide or universities in together, right? I think that would be really helpful, because I think not only are we saying, they're safe, but that we celebrate them. I think that's like an extra layer of a way in which we can identify and protect the most vulnerable population, which you mentioned, be the Chinese Americans in the United States. So.
That's great. I want to turn to an audience question now. The question is, can you talk a bit about China's predatory investing in this context? I would widen that out to maybe ask, Isaac, you in your book kind of lay out how the connections between the party state and China's economy, and understanding that is really fundamental to understanding the type of influence that you're talking about, and how it's different from what happens in the United States, where we know very, very well that there can be ties and links between, as you lay out, the government and the economy. So kind of talking about that predatory investing bit, but more specifically how that relates to those ties between the party state and the economy.
Every Chinese firm that has at least 3 people must have some form of party representation. So the question is not, is this firm have party influence? It's how much and what are they doing about it? And it's a very difficult thing to find out, because oftentimes the more information a firm gives, the more in trouble they can get. And so there's so much pushback within the Chinese system on some of these party rules and regulations, but hearing about it makes it harder for that firm to push back. And so, in some ways we don't want to encourage transparency. On the other hand, we very much need to. And I think it's about contextualizing and saying, you have a couple of options. You can restrict investment from any Chinese company. You can try to rank Chinese companies on their level of complicity. Mm-hmm. Or you can just ignore and say, they're fine. And I think I come down more on the second. We're not at the stage yet where we want to advocate for full decoupling. And so I think understanding, it's a little silly for China Construction Bank, a large state-owned enterprise complicit in Xinjiang, has a high ESG score, and is considered a sustainable company. Mm-hmm. That to me is quite silly. But understanding that it's a continuum and there are Chinese companies that are less complicit. I think the other issue, and this is what came up a lot with Huawei, is the issue is not, we know that this Chinese company is doing something, but rather, if Beijing asks, this Chinese company will have to. Huawei's founder, Ren Zhengfei, would say, we would disband before spying. And that's a lie. I think we can say that very clearly. And I think the issue is, we understand that as tensions grow worse, it's more likely for these companies to have to do it, even if they would strongly prefer not to, even if the people in these companies are very anti-party, don't like what the Communist Party is doing, would much prefer to be in the United States or Canada or elsewhere. That's the way the system works, and to have an understanding of that sad reality.
Can I just build on that? Because
yes,
I think one thing that makes this time, again, so fascinating is, under Xi Jinping, the CCP is kind of making the economy more so. The regulation that if you have more than 3 or more people, you have a Chinese Communist Party cell within your firm has been on the books for a long time, but now we're seeing it being implemented. And you look at common prosperity and what it's done to big tech firms and the kind of impulse of the CCP to kind of channel the economy into the directions that it thinks are important for geopolitical strength and power and competition. It's fascinating. Even a company like Meituan, which is a food service delivery company, is now having to allocate significant resources to kind of socially good causes that, in theory at least, detract from its ability to put those funds toward R&D or to give them back to shareholders. So I think one thing that people in the financial world are grappling with, and this has been going on for some time now, is really is the CCP making China uninvestable? Already there are these labyrinthine ways that you have to invest. You may not actually hold a share in a Chinese company. If you're an overseas investor, you might hold a variable interest entity share, which it's not exactly clear what that legally entitles you to. Now even companies that are presumably would be kind of in the safe or a real ESG measure score favorably are having to also serve these kind of CCP goals, which may involve repression or suppression. And I think people are having to grapple with, is this a market where we can trust that if we invest capital, we'll be able to get it out, that the company is doing the thing we think it's doing, that it'll be able to return value to shareholders. Those questions are kind of live and becoming more so with each day.
Kind of a related question from the audience, which is how do you all suggest that American CEOs should talk about values broadly in the context of China? And how should they bridge these differences between talking about values in the U.S. and also vis-a-vis China and in China itself? It's a tough question, but I think it's one that hopefully people are thinking about.
I think that's a great question. I think it's important to distinguish between Chinese values and party values. And the party's values are radically different from Chinese values, and there's a multiplicity, a huge variety of Chinese values that push against party values. And I think US CEOs need to understand that what their companies say in China, it's very easy to get translated to have those come back to the United States. And I think they need to understand that for most companies, not all, but most companies, the US market is more important for them than the Chinese market. And we're not having this conversation about the Cambodian market or the Thai market because those are so much smaller. We're talking about China because it's a massive and growing market. But I think people for so long have thought, well, I can advocate for the party's values and not realize how those contradict US values. And so I think they need to understand that there is a upside for advocating for US values at the expense of party values. And they need to understand that there are regulatory bonuses and market share and great PR that they can get because of that. I think also what we're seeing, and we see this very explicitly with the case of Bridgewater, where one of the former co-CEOs is now running for Senate in Pennsylvania and has been a lot more critical of the CCP than he was when he was at Bridgewater. And I think for those CEOs who want to have political careers, it's not an uncommon thing to understand that by shifting their focus and by being more explicitly against the party, this can provide a good platform for them to run for office, and they can do so in a way that doesn't degrade shareholder value.
Great. Any other thoughts on that?
One small point, but I think it's important. I was disappointed that this administration did not carry on the Trump administration's policy of referring to Xi Jinping as the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, because I worry that actually it may contribute to anti-Asian hate to portray him as a president, because when we hear president, we think of the choice of the people. And if we know one thing about a communist system, we know that Xi Jinping was not elected by any technique that we would recognize as an election or a popular election, notwithstanding the CCP's efforts to portray him as having very high approval ratings, helped by a poll that was published by my alma mater, Harvard. So I think we should not refer to him as President Xi. I think that's very confusing. I think we should call him the General Secretary, which is how he's known at home. If we want, we can call him the core and let people kind of figure that one out, but that's also how he wants to be known. I think we shouldn't sort of obscure the very real difference between their political system and ours, because if we don't give it its due and explain how different it is, we allow people to think, oh well, maybe the Chinese people love communism, maybe they love the CCP, and that's we are actually, I think if we think about it, we're trying to make sure that people in Asia are not victims of the CCP, whether it's religious believers in Xinjiang or the rest of China or Tibet or the people of Hong Kong or Asians across the Indian border who were just slaughtered, or the very real Asian victims of the CCP regime are our concern as well.
Well put. We are almost at time. Jennifer, I'll give the last word to you.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. I think I'm going to plug in for the importance of alliances. I mean, that's what I'm going to come back to, which, U.S. is not the only country, right, that's facing CCP's aggressive, coercive behavior, right? And we shouldn't be doing this alone, not because we can't or we're less powerful or that we've accepted some inevitability of China's ascend into some global power, right? We rely on the power of alliances because I strongly believe that CCP cannot withstand when U.S. and allies we're in lockstep to advocate for that transparency and fairness. hold each other accountable, to uphold the democratic values, and operate with integrity and honesty, they can't fight against that. And so, the Indo-Pacific strategy came out. People have different feelings about it. It's still a 30,000-foot view of the strategy, it remains to see how it's going to be implemented at all different levels of the government. But I think what's really clear is that we need our alliances, and we want more alignment with the world to work with partners who want to work with us and try to change and win the hearts and minds of the people who are not quite sure about us. So, alliances is going to be a way in which we're going to be able to navigate this era with China.
I think that's a really great point to end on. We are not the only country dealing with this problem that Isaac identifies in his book. Many of our allies are facing similar challenges, and perhaps there's lessons learned and ways that we can be collaborating with them to come up with better and more effective solutions to the problem. So with that, we are out of time for today's session, but I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us, Isaac and Jackie and Jennifer. And we look forward to hosting all of you again sometime soon. And thanks to our audience for joining and for asking compelling questions. Take care and have a good rest of your day.